Dr. Trexler.
Dr. Helms.
Science isn't doing a good job.
Scientists are doing a great job, but I agree. Science is it's floundering.
It is. And we're trying. We've been doing a series of podcast episodes here to respond to the common man, because we in the ivory tower can't really relate to them. But to respond to the common man's concerns that science is not useful, it's not applicable, it's invalid, it's a conspiracy, and also, despite being an ivory tower conspiracy, it's constantly disagreeing with itself and always flip-flopping, and we should throw the whole thing out. So, no, but in all seriousness, this episode is going to be a nice piece, a nice companion piece to our previous one where we discussed Brian Wansing's saga and the importance of replication and how essentially science does act to self-correct. But the unfortunate thing is that in the modern social media, podcast, and fast news kind of space that we all operate in, that correction is sometimes contained within the halls of science, if you will. And if at all it makes it out into the public sector, it is in a much smaller magnitude or volume compared to the original misconception that existed. So we're going to get into the specific issues of retraction, which we hinted at in the issue, in the discussion we had about Brian Wansing. We talked about, hey, a bunch of his data was retracted for these reasons, and now we actually have efforts to replicate that data. We talked a lot about replication, but we didn't talk about what is often the first step for some of these replications where there was something kind of nefarious going on or there's clear mistrust of data, the retraction process, or even a letter to the editor or message of concern. So, Eric, you are writing about this in a forthcoming issue of Mass, specifically about a relatively well-known article that was popularized. We'll get into who and how it was popularized in the metrics, but it became very popular, something that a lot of people were talking about, including us on different platforms, but has since been retracted. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely. So there was a study, I guess it's a year and a half, maybe a couple years ago at this point, by Nima and colleagues. And the study was called Impact of Cold Exposure on Life Satisfaction and Physical Composition of Soldiers. And this study really generated a lot of buzz pretty much immediately after it came out. And there's no surprise why. I mean, if you scroll through social media, I feel like pretty much whatever algorithm you've been sucked into, you're going to get a bunch of advertisements for cold plunges, which, as far as I can tell, Helms, correct me if I'm wrong, is basically a large bucket that is sold for about 7,000% the price of any other bucket. Am I missing something on that?
Well, I mean, we haven't factored in the cost of the ice, which I assume you get a discount on when you buy the bucket?
I guess. Yeah, lifetime supply of free ice for the $7,000 bucket.
Right.
Okay.
So when you consider that,
your break-even point
6,000.
is, you reach the break-even point as long as you live to the age of 190 and you keep doing it every day.
Which I'll point out, based upon some of the data on ice baths, I think is highly likely. Yeah, exactly.
So so this study, basically what they did was they reported that they had 49 soldiers in this study, 25 male, 24 female. Studies with military populations nowadays almost seem like a bit of a novelty, but back in the day, they weren't so uncommon. It was a lot more common to see research back in the day where I guess you could say participants were voluntold to kind of participate in studies. So soldiers, incarcerated people,
conscientious objectors after World War II.
Yeah. So back in the day, before we decided we were going to really tighten up our ethical approaches, so there's a lot more research done in kind of semi-voluntary populations. Now, that's not to say that there's anything to question the voluntariness of participants in this study, but when people say, why was this done in soldiers? Sometimes it's a very convenient population to sample. So this study was done in 49 soldiers between the ages of 19 and 30. Half of them were assigned to a control condition. The other half were randomly assigned to do what I would call a cold water intervention. So it was basically a mixture at different points in the study of an ice bath and cold showers as well. So this was a longitudinal study where at least 4 times per week, people were engaging in some form of this kind of cold water exposure, either with an ice bath or a cold shower for a particular amount of time. I think at least once per week, they were encouraged to do some type of outdoor cold water immersion. So like getting in a lake or a stream or something with very cold water. So less than 6 degrees Celsius or less than 43 degrees Fahrenheit, which is really, really cold, Helms. If you haven't been in 60-degree water lately, it is absolutely dreadful. Don't let the number fool you, because, water transfers heat and energy about 25 times faster than air. So you think, oh, a 60-degree room, that's not too cold. 60-degree water is absolutely unbearable. I'm being a little bit hyperbolic, but not by a lot. So before and after the intervention, they measured a bunch of different outcomes related to body composition. They also took a bunch of questionnaires to get at some, psychological and subjective types of outcomes. And they instructed participants throughout the trial, try to do your best to keep your diet and exercise habits pretty consistent. Do what you normally do, basically. So in this study, basically, the results, they were not overwhelmingly positive. They went ahead and split the results up and reported the males separately from the females in this particular study. But when you look at the body composition outcomes, generally there wasn't a whole lot going on that was significant. I should note, one thing that was, I'll start with a limitation. The statistical analysis just wasn't appropriate for the study design. So they just did a bunch of within group t-tests within, males in the intervention group, or males in the control group, or females in the intervention group, or females in the control group. So for each one of these 4 subgroups, they were just saying, did a thing change from pre to post after this longitudinal intervention? So that's really not an appropriate way to make inferences about, was this better than control, or was there a differential impact for males versus females? None of those tests were actually conducted within the analysis. So that's a really big limitation there. But, looking at the male data for the control group, really nothing going on, no significant changes in terms of body composition. But looking at the intervention group for males, there was a significant reduction in waist circumference and a significant reduction in visceral fat area. But something that's weird is that body fat percentage didn't change, fat mass didn't change significantly, body weight didn't change significantly. So it's for some reason, waist circumference and visceral fat just kind of in a vacuum changed. Looking at the female data, seeing nothing happening in the control group in terms of statistical significance, and no significant changes within the intervention group either for females. So, and then there was a huge number. I think they did 18 different statistical tests for the survey outcomes, and one of them was statistically significant. It was a change in something to do with sexual satisfaction, I think. So basically, yeah. So basically there was this huge panel of tests. Most of them came back non-significant, by a wide margin. A large percentage of these tests were non-significant. There was really no general trend where you would look at this and say, wow, that's broadly favorable data, even if you ignore the issues with the statistical analysis. Nonetheless, this was very quickly popularized as a major, major win for cold water immersion. And so I think if it had not been popularized right after publication, I don't think anyone would have cared. I think this paper would have been buried in a journal that's not a super high tier journal. It's relatively obscure, I'm not trying to be condescending, but it's just not a premier journal that would generally get a lot of eyeballs. And you can check the numbers for their other papers and say, oh yeah, nobody downloads these, right? So it's not to be dismissive. It's just a reality. There's a lot of papers that just kind of come and go and no one ever reads them, and they just kind of sit in a journal in perpetuity.
Yeah. And there's a ton of studies where an inappropriate statistical test is used. or you make a bunch of comparisons and you find one significant finding, and then you just kind of overstate your discussion and your conclusions based upon it, and you frame it as positive, and generally it just sort of doesn't matter. And eventually it either gets meta-analyzed or critiqued or not included because it's too high of risk of bias or something like that in the broader aggregate data, and it becomes a non-issue. Unless, like I guess you're going to get to, the press picks it up, or maybe some type of podcast host who describes their podcast as a lab, would you say?
Yeah, that sounds, you're getting warmer. Yeah, so basically, this study got popularized. Now, I covered this in mass when it came out.
You did.
And my interpretation on the surface, before I did any digging, was just like, okay, the results don't actually look very good. And the statistical tests were not appropriate. They were very, very liberal. So if you applied a more appropriate, rigorous set of testing, you probably would have come up with nothing here.
Yep.
And so my takeaway was, even just based on what was reported, there's really not much to write home about here. And I certainly wouldn't categorize this as evidence in favor of putting up with a very unpleasant intervention, 4 or 5 days a week. But because this became popularized, it caught the attention of other folks who really like digging into data. And so, when I say that this study was poorly reported, or I would even say arguably poorly executed, it was not like looking for a needle in the haystack in terms of trying to find a critique of this study. So like almost immediately there were 3 different pretty high profile folks who came out either with blog posts or like long Twitter threads or articles in lay press websites, basically saying, hey, there's a lot of stuff wrong with this study, and it jumps off the page at you. So like to kind of summarize some of the key issues that people were pointing out, I believe someone got their hands on the raw data, because I think it was a journal that has you make your raw data available, if memory serves. But basically, if you look at this study, there's kind of a lack of clarity about how many study conditions actually existed in the entire study and whether or not they were all reported. There's a lack of clarity about how participants were kind of like recruited and filtered out in terms of being able to participate in the study. There's some unclarity about whether or not there were duplicate participants who appeared to be completing multiple conditions within the same study, which statistically is, it's not that it can't be done, but it's that it needs to be accounted for if it is done. Yeah. And it certainly needs to be reported if that's the way it's done. There's a lack of clarity about whether or not the researchers participated in the study themselves as participants, which would introduce a number of issues pertaining to, blinding and expectancy effects and all those types of things. There were some data formatting inconsistencies that, like, theoretically could have like really tripped up a lot of popular statistical softwares. And like I said previously, the statistical analysis in general just wasn't really appropriate for the study design. So basically, there were all these different bloggers and science communicators who all at once were like, hey, there's a bunch of stuff wrong with this paper, and we certainly shouldn't be holding it up as, here, finally, someone's doing the good science, right? Like, there was stuff that needed to be addressed here. And I just want to reiterate, like, nothing that I've mentioned so far is like saying like any type of fraud has occurred or there's a nefarious motive behind this. This is just saying like, hey, sometimes work is done in a way that isn't really compatible with what we would consider best practices in science. And in many cases, it's just because people weren't aware of what those best practices are, how these data should be reported, things of that nature. So it could have just been completely, and likely was, just kind of innocent, like, hey, we thought this is how research is done, this is how we were trained, it's how we carried out and reported the study. And so we could live in a world where there's a very normal exchange of letter to the editor saying, hey, there's some issues here, they either are or are not correctable. No one's accusing anybody of anything nefarious here. We're not using the F word, fraud, but in order to maintain a really robust academic scientific literature, please either make these corrections, or if they're uncorrectable and this is fatally flawed, if you could kindly remove it from the literature via retraction, that would be the appropriate thing, right? So it doesn't always have to be a scandal. Sometimes it can just be like, hey, imagine like this, right? So we all know fitness stuff, right? So imagine someone who used to work with a coach signs up with you, and they give you the programming that they had been doing, and you look at it and you say, you know what? This would have been a great program based on everything we knew in 2004, but it's a little bit out of date. It's kind of old fashioned. There are some really important updates. This person isn't quite caught up to speed with how we do things in 2024, right? Doesn't mean that the previous person is a terrible person or that they're reckless and irresponsible. They're just a little out of date. They're not totally caught up to speed. They could use more training. They don't have a moral deficit, right? Yeah.
And I think just to give people a little peek behind the curtain. So first, just to kind of get everyone on, not bury the lead here, Huberman popularized this study and said it was basically a great example of why, cold water exposure is the bee's knees. Despite all these bloggers and all these issues and all these very obvious problems that aren't necessarily fraud. I think to someone who's not initiated as to how scientists are actually trained, especially if you have been present or even in some of the echo chambers in the modern era where there has been a understandable questioning of the quote unquote big science, if you will, or the medical establishment, probably related to COVID and all that. And I understand it's become politicized. If you think that there is a ivory tower, I think it is important to understand that that's really a mischaracterization of how people are trained, especially in places like exercise science, sports nutrition, which don't have big NIH grants and have less oversight. It is much more like your small mom and pop businesses equivalent of research. So what happens? How do you learn how to do research? Well, you go do a master's with someone, and then you go do a PhD with someone, and then you maybe do a postdoc if you stay in academia. And a master's is a much more heavily supervised, smaller project where you're probably given some guidance from PhD students in the same lab, as well as some limited guidance from your advisor. And the PhD, it's kind of a continuation of that, but on a larger scale. And then a postdoc is where you are actually have your doctorate and you're trying to build your CV so that you can get a tenured track role in the US or a more permanent role in other places. And in each one of those, there's an opportunity to basically learn how to do science, but it's all done, especially after the master's level in the first 2 years of your PhD in the States, or not in the PhD at all if you're in international programs where the PhD is only research. You're not having any formal classroom learning after the master's or early PhD stages on research design methods. And prior to, I would say, the last 10 years, there wasn't a ton of information or what was considered quote unquote best practice that was disseminated in any really high profile way, especially across normal media or social media channels. It was all basically, what did your mentor teach you? OJT. So to give you an example of how long this lasted, I did not know anything about open science. I didn't know what a preprint was until after my PhD, which I completed in 2017. And it was actually my students who have been teaching me more about it, and my exposure to people like James Steele, for example, who we had on to talk about open science. And that's not a shot at my advisors or their fault at all, because they weren't trained in that way. So you learn what you learn. And if what you learn is not necessarily best practice, up to date, or the ideal way of doing things, you can perpetuate these things and then you go and have students. So unfortunately, in some ways, there is no ivory tower. It's actually a whole bunch of beige shacks that are spread out all over the globe. And some people have access to better paint, better foundations. They understand architecture, and other people, they got their shack and they're out there, doing the science. And there are positive elements, there's negative elements. And one thing is that we just cannot paint research with broad brushstrokes, because you're going to find some absolutely atrocious research and you're going to find some amazing research. And if you're seeking to either heap tons of adoration at science because of the positive research and ignore the negative, or act like that takes away from the negative, or vice versa. You're painting with too broad of a brushstroke, and you just have to be comfortable with the idea that it's not a monolith. And unfortunately, that means you need to have some level of awareness of the quality of the methods that are used and the approach taken. And that's maybe not something that we can expect of the typical consumer of science-based content. And I think that's fair. But it does bring up the topic of, okay, well then whose responsibility is it to communicate the fact that this research may be of a higher or lower quality? And I think that does fall on the shoulders of the science communicator. And that results in some potential problems, which we're going to get into. So anyway, I just want to kind of catch the listener up on all of this. But you go ahead, keep going.
No, that's a good bit of context, and to kind of follow up with a bit of a metaphor. Like, so you could imagine, for example, if surgeons, if surgery was a medical field where there was no licensure, there was no state licensing exam to prove that you're up to date with everything, right? You basically imagine if surgeons, all of their training was set up as an apprenticeship. There is some dude in my town who does surgeries, or some woman in my town who does surgeries. I'm going to follow them around for 5 or 6 years. Then I'm going to do my own surgeries after that. You would not
just basically 1910, except women
right
allowed to do surgery. It's only different.
Right. So in that type of setup, you would not be stunned to learn that there's a great deal of variance with regards to the quality of surgeries being conducted, because there's no standardization, there's no centralized education platform, and no licensing body that ensures people are staying up to date and adhering to best practices. You just learned it from some person in your town and you followed them for a while. That's kind of what a PhD is. It's kind of an apprenticeship with just a little bit more centralized oversight than that, but not a ton. So, and then especially when you consider the fact that these are going on all over the world, right? You can see why there's a great deal of variance in terms of how we come across papers that are done up to the most rigorous, up-to-date methods and standards, and some that are about 15 years behind in terms of the way that they're working, right? So that shouldn't come as a surprise. And then to add another wrinkle to that, it's almost easier to have that kind of apprenticeship type approach when it is a field that's dedicated to practicing what is known, right? So here's how we do this surgery. We're going to let that education and knowledge trickle down to the next generation. Now go do. But with research, the very nature of it is that we're trying to answer questions that haven't been answered yet. It's not about applying what's known. It's about making unknown things become known, which usually means updating methods, developing new tests, developing new statistical procedures, and updating our ethical everything's being updated and changed, and everyone's doing it all over the world quietly in their own lab. And the only way that we can really sync up, it takes a great deal of effort and cost to sync up and actually do this well. So like just this past week, we actually, at my lab at Duke, we hosted an event where we flew in a bunch of people from all over the country, kind of our peers who work in similar areas focused on rural health. And we just got together for 2.5 days and ran like a mini conference and said, what's everybody doing? What's everybody seeing? What should we be doing? What are the biggest problems that we haven't solved yet? I mean, it was really like there was no other motive other than just let's sync up and figure out what everyone's doing and see how we can all collectively just do a better job. Now, the only way to make that work is if you have a tremendous amount of resources available. Not everybody can say, hey, we're going to do a little mini conference and fly people in from all over. So all of that is to say, it's tough to get all of science on the same page and say, this is how we're going to do everything. And that's why every now and then you get a paper that comes along that does get published, but you take a look at it and say, you really can't have people doing multiple different interventions within the same study, and you really can't be participating in your own study. I didn't even check up on that. I haven't verified whether or not that's really what went down, but there's a great blog post by Nick Brown kind of digging into some of the more like curiosities in this data set of, what exactly was the setup here in terms of study design and participant selection and things like that. But anyway, that's just a little background for people who are wondering, how does this happen? Well, it's not always like fraud, like, we decided we're going to, usually it's just the field is spread out over the entire world, and we're not all synced up, and we're not all up to date in terms of what the expectations are for how sciences ought to be done at the highest level. So let's get into the popularization. We've kind of been alluding to this and hinting at it. So obviously, Andrew Huberman has a podcast, the Huberman Lab, with a big YouTube channel and all that stuff, and people like it. And I think one of the really positive things about it is that it's got a lot of people interested in their own health. It's got a lot of people interested in science. And that's a positive thing. Unfortunately, in this particular case, I know that at least across 2 episodes, this study was framed in a way that was not... The study was referenced without all the caveats that ought to be thrown in there, right? So basically all the stuff we've said up to 5 seconds ago about how it's like, hey, there's like the wrong statistical test and, all this stuff. That stuff wasn't really mentioned. It was just like, hey, while we're talking positively about ice baths, check out this study, which is interesting, and it seems like there's some benefits to be had here. So it was referenced as, a positive and otherwise unremarkable study without really a lot of detail about the major limitations and potential issues with the data. So that was brought up in at least 2 episodes that I'm aware of. I know that he tweeted about it from his personal Twitter account on at least 2 separate occasions. Again, not to highlight the limitations or say, hey, contextualize this a little bit, folks. It was more just like, hey, more positive evidence for ice baths, basically. So people might be wondering, why does that matter, right? And this is where we get a little bit numbers heavy, and we start to get to my main pitch for today's episode, which is that retraction as a process is weird, and it doesn't do what we want it to do. I think in some cases it is excessively punitive, and in some cases it's just frankly ineffective for what we need as a scientific community. We need a different process to match these different needs that currently are all being addressed by the act of retracting an article. And retraction, I should clarify, is basically when, for whatever reason, either the authors choose or the journal insists or outside researchers write in and say, you need to do this. For any of those reasons, a paper that was published in a journal is essentially unpublished. They say, that thing that was, past peer review and was considered part of the scientific literature, it's not anymore. We're yanking that back. And they'll publish a retraction notice that may or may not provide context and details about why the retraction occurred, right? So thinking broadly about why retractions have occurred in the past, sometimes researchers will be going through their data and saying, oh crap, we made a mistake. They will flag it themselves, say there was an issue with our code. Our analyzer was on the fritz and we didn't know it. These numbers aren't reliable, right? So sometimes researchers will identify, for reasons that they were unaware of at the time, hey, we cannot trust these numbers, and they will go and have their paper retracted voluntarily. Now,
very common. There was actually a 20-teens meta-analysis on accommodating resistance where the authors wrote back in, I think in JSCR, and said, oops, we reported that this accommodating resistance is actually better than traditional resistance training. That is wrong. We would like to retract this. And it happens a lot, actually.
Yeah, and that's, I think it's really unfortunate that we don't have, so retraction right now could be used for that, which I would say is categorically across the board a positive thing. Like, if you find your own error, you should rectify that. Who's mad at someone for this? That's how it should work, right? Unfortunately, retraction is also used when someone is committing rampant fraud and fabricating data and cooking the books and using that to, commercialize some company or product that it's the worst of the worst, right? So that is also addressed by retraction. And I think it really sucks that when that academic is then moving on with their career and they've got that big old nasty retraction attached to their reputation, there's no gradient unless you're willing to really sit down with them and chat through what happened. To the outside observer, it's just you have that awful mark on your record of a retraction. And I think it's insane that we just like don't have any kind of layers or tiers to that system where it all falls under the umbrella of retraction and gives you those weird vibes when one of those cases is a very positive thing and the other is as bad as it gets in terms of research.
Yeah, there's a website that most researchers are familiar with that has a certain connotation and stigma to it, Retraction Watch.
Yeah.
And it is very much, it feels like a whistleblower, watchdog website. It reminds me as a bodybuilder, as like the Natural Bodybuilding Hall of Shame, where, this guy failed the drug test, let's put his picture up there, list the drugs that he had that was on the, I think probably still is on the INBA website. And they're not equivalent because Retraction Watch will report when you yourself as a researcher corrected the record quite admirably and took the time out of your day to go back and be like, you know what, people aren't even citing this 2014 paper anymore, but I can't stand that it's incorrect. And it is making our, approach to truth a little bit slower. So I'm gonna clean the mud off the walkway, and then boom, now you're on Retraction Watch, potentially right next to someone who committed outright fraud. So I totally agree. I think there is a stigma to retraction, which I think primarily it's in the public eye. They hear that and they think like, oh, this is a bad scientist. This is a bad guy. There's bad faith, bad actor. We got a problem.
Yeah, and even corrections have a bit of a stigma to them. So like, because every now and then a correction will result because, someone wrote a very pointed letter to the editor saying, hey, this paper's full of crap. And then you have to begrudgingly write a correction that, is terse and combative. So like sometimes even corrections have that feeling where they're like 1 degree removed from being a retraction, but the editor said, whatever, throw a correction on there, right? So yeah, I think right now the fact that we have just like corrections as a standalone thing and retractions as a standalone thing, and they both tend to have negative connotations associated with them, I think that's kind of unfortunate because, in my opinion, first of all, I don't think the retraction does enough to correct the damage when we have issues of, either unreliable data that have been popularized or outright fraud that has really hurt the reputation of a particular area of science. So in those cases, I don't think retraction really goes far enough. And then like I said, in the other cases, I think because it has such a punitive connotation with it, I think it perhaps makes researchers more hesitant to just be proactive about saying, man, we made a mistake here. We need to go ahead and correct the record. But they don't want that kind of cloud attached to their reputation of like, oh man, they've got 3 retractions because their analyzer was on the fritz during that 18-month period where they did these 3 projects, right? So yeah, all that is to say, it's a weird system, but moving forward, I want to focus on just the impact. A scientific finding gets out there, and for whatever reason, could be innocent, could be nefarious, could be somewhere in between, the data and the conclusions resulting from the data are not reliable. We need to correct what is known in the world, right? In many cases, that's addressed by just saying, okay, we're just going to retract the paper. And that's the case with this paper on, cold water exposure, the one that we've been talking about. I don't know if we've come out and said it directly, but that paper has been retracted as of about 2 or 3 months ago. Now, I mentioned that Andrew Huberman kind of popularized this paper. And I assume that, he saw it and, said, okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. I'm generally fond of cold baths. That seems like the stuff I'd expect to see. Probably didn't look into it too hard and said, yeah, okay, cool. Like, I'll make my folks aware of it because they like ice baths as much as I do. Totally innocent in nature. But the issue is now we've got this unreliable finding, which has since been retracted. But long before it got retracted, shortly after it came out, this was reaching at least, I would say conservatively, 5 million sets of eyeballs. That's approximately 10 million individual eyes, Helms, if we rely on some assumptions. But, basically through, there was this one tweet thread that he did about this article that on its own had 4.6 million views. One podcast episode with over 600,000 views, another podcast episode with, I think, over 1.3 million views. I mean, conservatively, 5 million at least, I would say, people who have been exposed to this finding, frankly, in an uncritical manner. Basically, people who earnestly are trying to follow the science are under the impression they're following the science by parroting this finding, right?
Yes.
Now, the paper's been retracted, but here's where it gets, here's the numbers that kind of support my general unease about how retractions, in some cases, are too punitive, and in this case, just don't do what we need them to do. Okay, so if you go to this website, the journal website where the paper was published, they make their, what they call alt metrics or alternative metrics available. You can kind of see how this paper's doing in terms of visibility and sharing and things like that. So I went to the website and I looked at the original article, right? Now, this does not count PubMed abstract views. This is just people who have viewed the abstract on the journal's website. But the abstract has been viewed about 55,000 times. That alone is kind of insane. Now, I know PubMed is eating up a big chunk of that, but there's about at least 5 million people out there who have been exposed to this, and we're seeing a very, very small fraction who are saying, you know what, maybe I ought to look into that and at least look at the abstract, right? Now, it gets even worse from there, though, because we're down from 5 million to 55,000 who have viewed the abstract. When you look at the full text views in the website itself, 391, and the people who, instead of reading it on the webpage, who would prefer to download the PDF instead, that's 580. So we're at less than 1,000 of people who actually dug into the full text with the methods and the detailed results. Now, what's really interesting, though, is that 55,000 number of abstract views on the website for the original paper. I went back in more than 2 months after the retraction notice was published, and it gets its own little web page on that journal site, and I can look at the same exact numbers. The abstract had been viewed only 683 times when I looked. So we've got 5 million people who heard from a trusted source that this is what the science tells us about ice baths, right? So of that 5 million, how many people have actually gotten to the abstract, just the abstract, saying, by the way, forget about that?
1%.
Less than 700, right? From 5 million. But something that I think is really fascinating, but not at all surprising. I think this is kind of cool. So looking at the full text, or the original text, right? So 55,000 abstract views, but less than 1,000 full text views. Only 900 or so, I think.
So 1% of the people who heard about it on social media actually went to see the abstract. And then I think 10%, 1,000 versus 55,000. So again, some very small percentage of them, 2% of the people who read the abstract then went to read the full text. And this is, again, of the paper, not the retraction.
Correct.
And then we talk about the retraction, and we're at some minuscule fraction of that.
Yeah, but what's really interesting is when you look at the ratio of abstract views to full text views for the original paper, huge, overwhelming discrepancy. People saw the abstract, okay, that looks good, not going to worry about the full text. When you look at the retraction notice, the abstract has been viewed as of the time I collected these data. I'm certain the numbers are different now, right? There were 683 abstract views, but the full text on the website had been viewed 695 times, and the PDF had been downloaded 151 times. So what that tells us is the group of individuals who is being made aware of the retraction notice, I would feel comfortable saying is a fundamentally different type of information consumer. We have more people who have viewed the full text of the retraction notice than have viewed the abstract, versus that like 2% number when it comes to the first study. So what it tells me is the only people seeing this retraction notice are the people who are like chronically tapped into the research and read full text and probably have a massive folder on their computer with 1 million PDFs that are categorized meticulously. These are fundamentally different populations of people. So the 5 million folks who are just kind of loosely trying to do their best to keep up with the big picture of science, these folks are never being informed of the retraction. And we can look at the specific numbers in this instance, but I think that this is a broader issue, which is that splashy findings get out, the public consensus gets formed around that, the retractions just go right by, and no one hears about them, no one cares about them. The public perception of the record never gets corrected, even if the scientific record itself does. And you might say, who cares? It's an ice bath, whatever. It's uncomfortable. You're going to waste $7,000 buying a bucket, and you're going to be uncomfortable for the first 15 minutes of your day, but whatever, right? But this stuff matters in a big way. Okay, so I know that I'm about to venture into 2 very contentious topics, but here we go anyway, because they're the most relevant things that come up with this discussion. I remember early days of COVID. There was a terrible paper published that really led people astray. I forget if it was one of the ones that diminished the risk of getting COVID or totally exaggerated the risk of getting vaccinated, but it had a public message that was categorically scientifically wrong. So I don't care like what your political or, whatever your view might be about this, it was a wrong paper, and it was one that led people to make health decisions that were categorically inadvisable at the time. They were, even if you thought they made the right decision, they were making it with the wrong data, right?
Right.
And it was another instance, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but this paper was all over the headlines, got a zillion downloads, and they said, well, don't worry, we'll retract it. No one ever downloaded the retraction. No one heard about it. The damage had been done. And if you,
it was retracted though.
But yeah, well, that makes us feel better, and it doesn't change anything about the world around us, right?
Exactly.
And an even more glaring example of this was going way back, and we're getting, if you can imagine, even more contentious, even more controversial. The original paper that linked vaccination to autism risk.
Yes, that's a fantastic example. I'm glad you brought that up.
It was a paper that made this link. And the scientific consensus overwhelmingly, when people started digging into the paper, was that the findings were unreliable and were not supported by the broader scientific evidence available. The paper was retracted, but now, it's got to be decades later at this point. There is still a pervasive idea that there is this strong causal link between vaccines and autism risk. And it really does trace back to one paper that got retracted, but it was long after it had already been popularized, and a lot of people essentially had made up their minds about this link. It basically had enough meat on the bone to confirm a lot of biases that were out there and reinforced a lot of concerns that weren't actually rooted in data. And so I guess my ice baths, like I said, who cares? Big deal.
Yeah.
But the broader conversation to be had is the fact that when we look at folks who do the work of popularizing and communicating science, I think we have to take very seriously the responsibility to stay up to date with what's being retracted and to communicate the nature of those retractions with the same level of vigor and enthusiasm that we communicate the original finding. So how do we get a retraction in front of 5 million people? Rather than the splashy finding that eventually turns out to be unreliable. So I guess the broad kind of takeaways from this whole saga and many prior sagas like it. What's the plural for saga? Is it just saga?
Sagas.
Okay.
I think it's sagas.
So
and now people are going to have the wrong impression about what plural for saga is. They're going to be saying, we get tens of thousands of people listen to Iron Culture, and there's going to be grammar retractions, and they're going to have no impact. You're going to think the wrong plural form of saga. That's just, playing into the narrative.
Yeah. So the whole point of this podcast is me putting out into the ether, into the world. We need to do better. Science needs to have better mechanisms to deal with the process of correcting the record, whether that's through retractions, corrections, things of that nature. Ideally, we would have some kind of tiered system or gradient system that helps people see like, hey, there should be a different perception of a well-intentioned correction of previous errors versus, well, I committed fraud and got caught with my hand in the cookie jar. So science needs to do a better job with that. Science needs to do a better job getting the word out. Like a lot of these journals and the universities of the folks that publish work, they do literal press releases. They have essentially marketing arms that get this out into the biggest websites and newspapers and headlines. They literally work to generate the web traffic to surround these findings. Science needs to do a better job of bringing that same energy to getting the word out about retractions, and they don't. And the reason why they don't is because no one looks good. When a paper gets retracted, again, because of the negative connotations associated with any retraction of any nature, the journal looks bad when their paper gets retracted. The authors certainly look bad. The university that employs the authors look bad. So who in the world is going to be doing the work of trying to get that headline spread far and wide? If anything, they're going to go out of their way to make sure no one ever really hears about this. Keep it on the down low, folks.
Yeah.
So that's
also the work itself is harder.
Yeah.
This is something that has been, it's an issue in science, and I'm glad we're talking about it. And I think you've made some excellent points here, but it's also a human issue. And it goes back a long ways. In the information age, it's been come to known as Brandolini's law, or the bullshit asymmetry principle, which became a thing in 2013. And it was Alberto Brandolini, an Italian programmer, who emphasized that the effort of debunking misinformation in comparison to the relative ease of creating it in the first place is asymmetrical. He stated the amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than that needed to produce it. When I had Lane on, and it was just our conversation, he was saying how, he does these what look like short clips and videos where he goes through why someone is wrong. And if you want to say some stuff like, all you need to do is find one study, knowing the metrics that only 1% of people are going to read the abstract, not the full text, that loosely seems to support what you're saying. I guarantee you, there's enough research out there. Go search, chocolate reduces prostate cancer. You'll probably find something that could be twisted into saying that. You make a reel, and you could say, hey, good news for all you chocolate lovers out there. We've got some, old data I dug up from back in the day in 1996. Guess what? Chocolate may not be the thing that you want for your waistline, but your prostate is probably going to be healthier for it. Follow me for more health-related context. The person who wants to debunk that has to go pull up the full text of it, read it. You didn't have to do that, right?
Yeah.
And then they need to go, okay, well, why did they get it wrong? Is there other data on the topic? How do I present it? Let me pull some full text. Oh, this is from 1995. Let me contact the university librarian and see if I can get, an interlibrary loan, see if I can get this. And then I have to produce a video where I go through all of this and explain why your claims are incorrect. So it is just simply more work to present the truth than a falsehood. And that's why even before the 2013 Brandolini's law, you can find quotes that go all the way back to the 1800s and the 1700s. There's a quote, and I'm going to share this before I shut up and let you keep talking, that was from, Frederick Bastiat. We must confess that our adversaries have a marked advantage over us in the discussion. In very few words, they can announce a half-truth, and in order to demonstrate that it's incomplete, we are obliged to have recourse to long and dry dissertations. And then there's an even more classic quote from 1710. A lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth can get its boots on. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was going to say, to kind of reinforce your point, getting to that example that you mentioned of, chocolate and prostate cancer, right? And so let's say you do all that work and you called the librarian and you did the whole thing and you made the video and you said, nope, I put this together. It took me forever, but for these specific reasons, that finding that you're talking about isn't reliable. All they have to do is say, well, you know that paper you got from your librarian and the other 3 like it? They had a slightly different percentage of, this was like the 85% dark chocolate. That's why it worked this time and didn't work those times. All it takes is one little difference from the literature that you're drawing upon, and they'll say, I mean, how many times have people say, well, no, the thing is, it's just different in men, and that study was in women. Or, well, those folks were 55 and older. I'm talking about people under 55. And it is so...
That adaptation wasn't long enough, Trex.
But it is so easy to find one little wrinkle where you just open up a plausible window into, well, what I'm saying could maybe theoretically possibly be true in a circumstance, right? And so that is another factor that makes it so incredibly difficult to push back against some of these, extrapolated ideas or more speculative ideas and things of that nature. Is like, if you're speculating about something, that it means you probably don't have direct evidence for it. And there's probably not a good chance that I'm going to have direct evidence to really conclusively refute that, right? So you basically just have to, it's almost like the, like the criminal court system of like innocent until proven guilty. It's like, I'm going to get away with whatever claims I want until you can absolutely nail me down and have no wiggle room to get out of this. And more often than not, it takes just if it's even possible, it takes an immense amount of time and effort to make that happen. And so that's where we get into the situation where we've got a lot of really mixed messaging being communicated from the scientific evidence that's being generated. Now, I do want to say one thing here, and I wanted to make sure I made this very, very clear. There was one occasion in 2013 where I said something incorrect. I haven't slept since. I lay awake at night wondering if I may someday be wrong again. And people tell me it could happen, and I accept that risk. So obviously I'm being facetious, but the bar for science communicators is not to never get it wrong, right? And even if you're doing your due diligence, sometimes, rarely, fraud happens. It's not your fault if you get duped by a fabricated data set, so I get what I'm saying is like, it's not a science communicator's job to never, ever, ever be wrong. But what I would hope to see from science communicators is, first of all, they do their due diligence, look at papers, and before they repeat the claim, say, is this a high quality paper just based on the kind of superficial characteristics? Check it out, give a critical appraisal of the paper before accepting or refuting the findings that or its conclusions that it's presenting, right? So that's the first thing, is give me a... Yeah.
Can I give a hot take on that one?
Sure.
What do you think about this? Someone wants to implement scientific findings into their own personal training or their own concept of the world, and they just want to read the abstract. More power to them. Ain't nobody got time for that? Sure.
And you don't even have to do that. You can do whatever the hell you want. You don't need an abstract to make a decision.
Right. I agree. You can decide to do whatever you want in the absence of science. But if you decide to make content about science and you don't read the actual science you're promoting and you just read the abstract, personally, I think that's unethical and you shouldn't be communicating that science. Now, after that first statement, there's a whole can of worms here because some people are going to have the statistical chops or the understanding of methods, et cetera, to accurately view it. But I think a minimum bar should be you have to actually read the full text of the study to the best of your ability before you decide to share that information with other people. Is that unreasonable?
It's not unreasonable at all. No, I think, like I said, I think that's kind of, I think it's important to set these expectations, right? So the expectation is not never be wrong, never get duped by a good scheme that's being cooked by a nefarious reason. We can't put that on people. But like you said, before you popularize an idea, yeah, I think it's fair to say that there is a intellectual and ethical requirement to, before you say a thing is true, to vet it, at least at the very minimal level of reading the full paper. Now, there's going to be some papers that you have to incorporate into your synthesis of information that, frankly, you're not well equipped to appraise. So, for example, Helms. Here's a good example. You and I are both those mythical peers that participate in the peer review process, right? Do you accept every review invitation you get?
I reject the vast majority of them on basis of time. But on the ones where I have the time and I'm like, what, I need to do maybe a review this quarter, I reject the majority of them because I'm being asked to review something that's outside of my area of expertise.
Right.
And I go, no, I'm more likely to get this wrong than right. Or there's too high of a probability for me to be comfortable as a peer reviewer on this that I might miss something.
Yeah. So the reason I bring that up, I'm in the same boat. I've gotten many invitations to review a paper where I say, I can generally read this and generally interpret the findings and incorporate them into my knowledge of the topic and the research area. But it takes a completely different level of familiarity and expertise to say, I am going to be the arbiter of whether or not this gets incorporated into the academic body of literature, right? So I would agree with your statement with the caveat that the bar for communicating science is not that you have that extra layer of expertise where you literally are qualified to be the peer reviewer who accepts or rejects it. But you absolutely do need to, at minimum, take a step, read the full text. And if there's anything that absolutely baffles you and you're just like, I'm not even reading a language I'm familiar with here, then at that point, you might say, I probably shouldn't be communicating about it either to a public audience, right?
I totally agree. I think that's a great way of framing it. Thank you. I will let you continue.
Yeah. So what I expect from a science communicator is not to always be right, not to only, broach the topics that you are, top 0.1% of the world in terms of your ability to read it and appraise it. I would expect, that you've done that due diligence before you communicate it, that you do your best to stay on top of the literature and keep an eye out for contradictory evidence so that if you have been led astray, you can then communicate to your audience, uh-oh, folks, we got a new finding that actually refutes the stuff we all like. Let's keep an eye on that. I mean, that happens in mass all the time. We always, whenever we see a new paper that comes out and we say, oh crap, we've reviewed 2 other studies saying conclusion A, but there's a new study on the topic saying conclusion B. And so we take it upon ourselves to reconcile, why might this be? Maybe we change our mind because the new evidence is stronger or points out a meaningful critique of the prior evidence. Maybe we say, oh, this new paper actually overlooked something and we're going to stick with conclusion A. But either way, we inform our audience not just of the confirmatory evidence, but also the contradictory evidence. And you can only do that if you're staying on top of the literature and the new stuff coming out. And then, of course, that includes the retractions, right? So if you really hitched your wagon to a study and later it gets retracted, I do think that there is an ethical, this is again where I'd say ethics come into play. There's an ethical responsibility to spread the word about the retraction every bit as much, if not more, than the amount that you put effort into spreading the word on the original finding, just to make sure, that any folks who you have inadvertently, unintentionally led astray with that finding, you are kind of communicating back to them. Imagine if anyone in your day-to-day life, they said, hey, how do I do this thing? And you tell them, and then 15 minutes later you say, oh crap, no, that's the old way. The new version doesn't work that way. Of course you'd reach out to them and say, hey, before you do that thing, the advice I just gave you 15 minutes ago, that's not going to work. You got to do it a different way. It's the same thing with science communication. I think you got to get that word out. And so, communicating that stuff. And then finally, I think the mark of a good science communicator, and something I expect of a science communicator, is there's all this research going on, right? And there's going to be findings that strongly support your perspective on something, and things that kind of contradict, and things that maybe severely contradict your current existing perspective on something. My expectation of a good science communicator is that they just keep their audience abreast of how their perspective is changing over time. And, we're not running for political office. No one's going to accuse us of being a flip-flopper. And if anything, when I see a science communicator who has the same exact kind of list of points that they've been making since 2011, that really erodes my trust in them, because I'm like, dude, if you haven't learned a new thing since 2011, you're either A, not at all connected to the literature, you are not reading shit anymore, or B, you are engaging with the literature only for the purpose of reinforcing that book that you would like to continue selling, that is still on its first edition from 2011.
Yeah, I've heard a couple wild claims from science communicators. It just makes me realize maybe we're not seeing this the same way. I've heard specific science communicators say things like, "I've never been wrong," and that's amazing, to me. Like, whoa, so you're like, this is about your ego. This is not about staying up to date, and it's to the point where it's blinding you. And I've heard other science communicators, and I struggle to even use that term given what I'm about to say, suggest that we shouldn't do any more research on this topic because it's just muddying the waters and confusing it. I've got a model, and it explains it. We've got this figured out. Move on. And strangely enough, it always seems to come up whenever their model gets questioned that we don't need more research on this. So yeah, if you are seeking a science communicator out and they claim, especially if they've been around for more than, 5 months, that they've never been wrong, and they seem to take pride in that, especially, or that they suggest, as a quote-unquote science communicator, that we shouldn't be doing more science, almost in any context, not like, hey, we shouldn't be doing this type of science that's done incorrectly, but no, we've got this one figured out, no more research on it, especially in contexts where we don't actually have applied research directly studying the thing they're talking about. Run the other way, because they are 100% not science communicators. So
yeah. Oh, that's so funny. It's basically like, okay, I've constructed this house of cards. Nobody breathe. Like, I don't want this thing to fall down.
Don't touch it.
Oh, that's terrible. Yeah. So I want to be really clear here, though, because we are, in the case of this episode, very directly covering a specific paper that was largely popularized by a specific science communicator, Andrew Huberman. Now, when we then branch off into a broader discussion of what are the characteristics of an effective science communicator, or what do we expect from an effective science communicator, I don't want people to think that that is some veiled critique where every single comment there is just a barb or a jab at Andrew Huberman. Like I said to kick off the episode, I think that it's fantastic that he is reaching a huge number of people who are now more interested in their own health, who are perhaps engaging in more health-promoting behaviors. You go to a lot of the stuff that he promotes, and it's, sleep well, exercise, eat well, wake up in the morning if you can. If you're not doing shift work, that would preclude it. That stuff's nice, So, like, I don't want it to seem like we're saying, like, hey, Andrew Huberman, shame on you for doing what you do, and you should, close up shop and all that stuff. Like, that's not how I feel. I don't like to get into the back and forth and, just like shots across the bow criticizing people. But I do think in this particular instance, if you were to ask me, what is a good outcome of this whole conversation, I think it would be terrific if, like I said, an expectation of mine for science communicators is if you popularized something that later gets debunked or retracted or something like that, popularize the retraction with every bit of energy and enthusiasm that you did in the first place with the original finding. So I would hope that if he hasn't I don't know. I don't consume his content. So maybe he's already corrected the record and it's just going to take some time to make its way around the internet. But if he hasn't, I would hope that he would.
Eric, you're a lovely human being. And I know I joked about your background being a AI-generated standardized background people can download, and you even joked that his name's Zen Magic, but that's your legitimate background.
Yeah.
This man is, he seeks harmony. You produce harmony. You make the world a better place. So I'm going to go ahead and just be the bad guy here and say, I don't have that favorable view of Andrew Huberman. I think he's been actively doing more and more harm, and some of the fact that he does say some reasonable things at the same time almost acts to have a bit of a sheep's and wolf clothing thing at this point. When you see somebody platforming the idea that there is, harm in fluoride in public health water, when they have,
I don't support that, by the way.
Good. When they have consistently put up exaggerated claims and had expert creep, I see it this way, Trex, that the level of responsibility you carry to the level of context and accuracy that you provide not only should scale with the operation of your science communication, but it's actually easier to do with your larger platform because Huberman is not short on cash flow. I think we can agree with that if we just think about the fact that advertisers on a podcast tend to scale to the number of listeners. And if you have a substantial amount of income for a show that is purporting to accurately communicate science to help people, why can't you pay a few PhD students in a few different realms who are well trusted a meager amount of money that could still potentially really fit into your profit margin, I suspect, to do the due diligence? So this makes sure that you have a lower probability of getting it wrong, rather than what it seems like here, maybe just being one of those metrics who just read the abstract before you put it out on a tweet that hits 4.9 million people. And considering, mass, we're doing okay, but we are orders of magnitude lower in terms of the scale of reach we get for the science communication field. And we only review stuff in our specific narrow phase, and we have internal peer review. And when we don't think that we can actually accurately get the information on something that we are reviewing, what do? We reach out to the authors and our colleagues who maybe know better than us. So no, Eric, I don't think Huberman gets a pass, and you don't have to say it, but I will. I'll be the bad guy. Not a fan, not sure it's a net positive, and shame on him.
Well, okay, let me turn this around. Shame on you, Helms, for
I'll take it.
Mischaracterizing my words maliciously. Because I wouldn't say I give him a pass.
True, you did not say that.
I did mention that I don't consume any of his content. Here's my idea of a perfect world.
Can I retract my statement that I just made?
Yes,
I know not many people are going to hear.
But that will follow your retraction. Or that retraction is going to follow you around in terms of your reputation for the rest of your life. So you have to think carefully.
You know what? We'll compromise. I'll take a correction, and I will just say you just provided the correction right there with what you said, and I will abstain from responding and allow that correction to stand with no response.
Okay. Yeah. So I think I view this very pragmatically. So there is, if I say I don't like that podcast or that YouTube channel, nothing happens. It doesn't matter. It still exists, right? My kind of idealistic view of, pragmatically, what does a good path forward look like is that, maybe Huberman does popularize this retraction and say, oh, hey, folks, lesson to be learned by all of us. Make sure you double check that PDF, download it, take a peek at it. I'll do better in the future. I want to keep you folks abreast of the, current findings in this area that we follow so closely. I'll get it, I'll stay on top of it more. Maybe this is the factor that finally
watershed moment.
Maybe this is what inspires him to get that team of fact checkers, which I know a lot of podcasts do have, especially in the journalism area, which is more of the podcasts I listen to. They always credit their fact checkers at the end. Maybe this is a learning lesson. Maybe it's something that inspires some change. And while I don't currently consume any of that content, nor have I ever encouraged anyone to do so, I'd love to be open to a future where I feel comfortable doing that. Wouldn't that be lovely, Helms, where this large platform with a lot of viewers and listeners gets better and rises to the occasion, and then people like you and me would feel comfortable, if not enthusiastic, about saying, you know what you should check out? You should check that out.
Folks, protect this man. There's very...
I'm not an idiot, I'm just positive.
No, you're not an idiot. You're just a better person than most people. And let me just say that I'm a better person for being in your presence. And your perspective is, in all seriousness, I think that is the ideal perspective and the ideal outcome. Likelihood aside, probabilities of things happening.
When have I ever valued probabilities? It's not like I enjoy statistics.
There you go. Well, you know what? Just because something is improbable does not mean it's impossible.
I do love a low p-value.
We do, even if it was, p-hacked to get it. Now, I have a question for you, because I think it might be useful, another little peek behind the Wizard of Oz curtain. I've been involved in some letters to the editor, basically establishing a mark of concern. I'll be very transparent about that. It's on the public record, related to the HMB plus ATP paper, along with like half of the scientific field in our area for the Wilson paper, because I did think that data was probably incorrect for whatever reason. And I had some major concerns with the methods as well. I have not been involved in the efforts to retract a paper. Do you know more about the efforts to retract a paper, or what that is like, to give people some insights? Is it worth, diving into that?
Sure. I mean, I have had some visibility into that general process. And to be completely frank, the process isn't really different. This is a very poorly constructed sentence, but let me start over. Procedurally, it's not particularly different. I think the main difference is the persistence with which it is followed up on, the aggressiveness with which the call to action is levied, right? So for example, a letter to editor, you would say, hey, I have concerns about this paper and I would sure love to hear some kind of explanation, right? Help me. I think a good letter to the editor is written as if you're playing my character of the foolish optimist, and you say, wow, I don't understand how these data came to be the way they are. I would sure love clarification. And my best case outcome here is that you explain to me what I'm missing, and I go, oh, fantastic. That makes all the sense in the world, right? When someone says, hey, we need to get this retracted, it still usually is contacting the editor. Usually they'll say, well, go, if you have a problem with it, write a letter to the editor. Don't clutter up my inbox, write the thing. So you write the thing, and it's usually a lot more aggressive in tone. And it usually doesn't say, hey, I'd love some clarification here. It usually either explicitly or implicitly indicates there's no coming back from this. There's no correction that makes this make sense. These data are fatally flawed or impossible, and as a result, this thing's got to go. So I think procedurally it looks the same on the surface, but deep down, then it becomes a whole thing of following up and following up and following up and saying, hey, that response that they published obviously isn't adequate, editor. You need to retract this thing. And then they'll probably say, well, we're just a journal. What do we have to do with publishing? We don't have they really will say that. I've seen people more or less just say like, what are you looking at us for? We're only the people who literally host the article and decided it was published. So they'll in some cases, play dumb and act like they have nothing to do with it. And they'll say, if you got a problem, you need to contact the institution where the lead author or senior author or corresponding author did the work, and they need to investigate it. And so a lot of times if you really want to follow up with all that, it's basically a part-time job. And so that's why, I don't know if you mentioned this before we started recording or after, but the idea that science is self-correcting, I think is true in spirit, but not really all that accurate in practice. Science isn't self-correcting because science is just a broad collection of actions that are undertaken by scientists. The literature gets corrected when one scientist or a group of scientists get really bent out of shape and decide that they are going to allocate a rationally indefensible amount of time, energy, and persistence toward getting a paper retracted. The amount of time and effort, and in many cases risk, that goes into correcting the scientific record, frankly, from a purely rational perspective, is not worth it. And it sucks to be a scientist who can say that. And I'm the optimist, okay? Go back 5 minutes ago, and I'm not being like the pessimistic, cynical guy here, but it is a bad state when a scientist says retraction. Who has the time and effort and stomach for all that? I mean, look no further than a current ongoing situation where some folks took issue with data pertaining to, I don't want to call anyone out by name for obvious reasons we'll get into, but there's currently a big investigation going on with a researcher at an Ivy League institution. There were a team of very quantitatively oriented folks who took issue with some of this individual's papers, contacted journals, contacted universities. People make decisions, papers get retracted, people get put on leave, et cetera, et cetera. All of a sudden, you're defending yourself in a lawsuit that is, has a lot of zeros at the end of it. And even if you win the lawsuit, no one wins a lawsuit. you just don't have to pay as much at the end of it, right? But you get dragged through the worst process of your life. It drags on forever. You have to find liquidity, actual liquid cash on hand to actually fund your defense, even if you're completely in the right. So yeah, man, I wish I could say that the retraction process is a purely academic process that is handled with dignity and grace, but it's a mess. It's ugly. And at the end of the day, basically all parties involved are more focused on liability and plausible deniability than they are correcting the scientific record, because it's just a mess the way that it's organized.
Thank you. I'm really glad you. That's. I knew you had that insight, and I wanted you to share that, because the phrase "science is self-correcting" more speaks to relatively hard science with predictable outcomes and the scientific process.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if Newton had said, "You know what? I don't think the apple's going to fall every time. We should test this a whole bunch," and he managed to, construct it. Like, I was in a wind tunnel and the apple didn't fall. It kind of hovered there for a second. So we don't have this thing called gravity. It only works sometimes. You repeat that multiple times and you go, no, it's falling a lot and it's only the wind tunnel. So it's not an issue with gravity. It's this thing called wind resistance, self-correcting. But the process of publishing those findings is not the same thing as the scientific process itself. And then the process of getting those published findings out to the people who are not in the beige shacks of exercise science is a whole nother thing. Like we said, even when the retraction process, which as you described is incredibly painful, is successful, there is potentially unearned stigma when it could be something that is relatively benign and altruistic on the part of the authors themselves, or it's something that is really should be well known and well published, but it doesn't get out there because of that bullshit asymmetry principle. And people maintain the belief that ice baths are going to do everything for them, when in fact the study that they believe supports that was retracted, but they don't even know about it.
Yeah. And I think you point to a really interesting bias that I hadn't recognized in my own thought. But as you and I are people who publish science and do scientific experiments actively. And it really, your comment gets to the heart of the question, what is the science, in quotation marks, right? And so there's like, well, is science the natural world around us and the kind of intrinsic realities of the world that we inhabit, that we are trying to uncover? Or is the science the scientific apparatus of folks who are trying to approximate those realities? Or is it the actual written record of the work of that giant, group of people independently striving? So you could kind of define the science in about 3 different ways. And I agree with you that the first, the kind of laws of physics, and, the laws that govern this natural world that we live in, that is self-correcting, or at least our experiments that objectively try to approximate those realities will be self-corrected in time, because, you cannot repeatedly prove a non-truth, objectively speaking. But yeah, then you get into other layers of what the science is, and that can be, there can be major barriers to actually correcting the record. For example, one of the cliche ones is, our field agrees that we do not challenge the findings of this person because they are like the godfather or godmother of the field. They can do no wrong. And if you decide that you're going to carve out the next 5 years of your academic trajectory trying to disprove all the stuff they built their career and reputation on, you will, there's no explicit collusion, but you'll essentially be blacklisted. We don't do that around here. Your reputation will be tarnished because we don't go after their work. It's too built into the DNA of this field until 30 years later, after they're long gone, we say, yeah, that was probably never true, right? So there's a lot of, kind of structural and political layers of friction that can really slow down the process of that self-correction when you look at science as a big apparatus or a collection of literature.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking specifically when you were talking about that, I'm like, oh man, there was a lot of barriers to the theory of relativity actually being accepted at the time it came out in the political climate during World War II, during the reemergence of fascism, et cetera, like reading some things about Einstein's journey and all that, and the barriers he had there. Very interesting stuff. And unfortunately, humans are the ones who are doing research. But to now,
for now,
for being
for
now, that's true. Unfortunately, humans are the ones programming the AIs. How about that?
Yeah.
But I will say that to move on from being cynical towards optimistic, I think it's really important to point out, in this specific instance that spurred this meta conversation, the article that got retracted because, or at least in part, because it was published in a journal that required a full data set to be uploaded. And the open science movement is one of perhaps the most important movements in the modern age of science, and it is working. It is leading to more retractions, even if retractions are ineffective, incredibly arduous, and costly. And even when a retraction doesn't necessarily occur, it does help us contextualize findings, reanalyze them, correct the record, and popularize or promote information in a better manner. I think we have recently seen some pretty big shifts in the perspective we have because of preprints. And even though I mentioned I was part of that letter to the editor, none of the papers that I seriously question that came out of that letter to the editor and others have been retracted, but there is a generally well-known and popularized understanding that the data that came out from that lab group at that time only, by the way, it's really important to point out, we need to levy your awareness of issues specifically. When someone is at an institution, sometimes you kind of associate their name with that institution. When they are then not at that institution anymore, it kind of should follow them, not the institution. So good work is being done at the University of Tampa these days. Let me just say that. and I don't think the work that is under question by Wilson, I'll be very direct here, should retain some kind of stigma related to the University of Tampa. So anyway, none of Wilson's work has been retracted to my knowledge, even though there were multiple letters to the editor. Yet there does seem to be an understanding that that data is very, 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 very questionable. And that's probably not a bad thing, but it is definitely a double-edged sword. As we talked about, it's very possible, just like with Brian Wansing's data, that some of the things that we have this stigma around could have been true. I don't think that's necessarily the case in the example I'm giving, but that's why we need all of these pieces to work, and they need to work better in the case of retraction, so that we don't have to wait. The Wansing paper was from 2005, 2023, 2024. I can't remember which year it actually got published in when that replication occurred. And now we're going, oh, yeah, maybe visual cues are important for deciding when you stop eating.
Yeah. And I think it's worth mentioning, we talk so much about retraction and correcting the literature. And some folks might, I think, justifiably be wondering, well, why does it really matter all that much? And I think the issue is that without some process of removing unreliable findings from the literature, you run into situations where people waste time and resources following up and doing research based on unreliable preliminary findings. Research is incremental. We build on past findings. And unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, it's a big world out there. Not everyone knows the whispers when you say, oh, hey, by the way, no one really takes that finding all that seriously, so kind of just assume it's not there. Not everyone knows that. And so then you have a group on the other side of the world who says, oh, wow, look at this finding sitting here in the literature that no one has picked up the ball and run with it. And then sometimes you'll even, in the case of, really high profile work, you'll see that unreliable findings, before they garner a very skeptical reputation, will start to actually get integrated into clinical practice or government guidelines. And these things start to then actually impact the world around us. And so retraction, I don't want people to think I'm saying that retraction is unimportant. But my main thesis here is that there's probably a better system that more clearly cleans up the literature, indicates the nature of that clarification, and then actually gets that information out to the stakeholders who need to know about this important update. And while we're on the topic of retractions, I figure the best way to do this topic justice, since we've been talking about one particular paper as the jumping off point for this conversation, I should, in the interest of transparency, read the very short retraction notice, the actual justification that came out with the retraction. So they said, the authors and journal are retracting this paper. So it's a joint agreed upon decision to retract the paper. After a complaint, the authors audited their data and identified errors in the analysis, including the incorrect inclusion of the incorrect inclusion of subjects from other ongoing studies. On the basis of this, the study findings are now unreliable. In addition, the study design is ambiguous. The authors apologize and say that the errors were unintentional. So that largely reinforces a lot of what we've mentioned, how this very well could have been unintentional. Folks who, in hindsight have probably said, yeah, not a great design. We didn't have enough logistical management of how our participants were recruited and run through these various studies. Should have done a different statistical analysis. And so, the paper is being retracted, and hopefully this episode will reach 5-6 million folks, and then, hey, no harm, no foul.
I don't think that's unrealistic at all. We are coming up probably on 6 million total downloads ever since 2018. So long as we have this episode slightly more successful than the entire lifetime downloads of the whole podcast across all platforms, we're good to go.
If everyone shares it with 200,000 friends, then and make sure they download it, then we should be fine.
Yep. So you know what to do, folks. We normally ask you to give the show a rating and a review. And generally folks around here do rate it 5 stars. We also ask you to hit like. And now all we're asking you to do is to download some type of software that scrapes the emails and social media profiles of the 195,000 people who you don't already have, if you are already well on social media, and simply send it to them. So minor ask, we've been doing a lot of this free, awesome content for you for years now. So all we're asking you to do is spend the better part of the next few months working on doing that. And, then we'll call it even Stevens.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Awesome. Well, Trex, is there anything else you think needs to be said on this topic or that we want to cover? Maybe we want to be solution oriented. You mentioned where we'd like to get to. Do you have any ideas on how that could actually operate? Or are you just someone who's going to point out a problem and say, hey, fix it, folks?
Well, I want to, first of all, reiterate kind of my picture of the effective science communicator, what I hope that people will strive for, even if you've got a long track record of maybe not adhering to these principles. Let's all do better moving forward. Present company, especially Helms. So
I'm looking at the man in the mirror.
Like we talked about, before you popularize a paper or incorporate it into your work, make sure you read it. Read the paper, and if you need to ask someone for a second pair of eyes or to clarify something, do your due diligence to get to the bottom of what this paper actually says. Number two, I would say it's important that if you are going to present that data, present it in a way that's contextualized. It's okay to say, I believe that these findings are, robust and generalizable, but there is a pretty important limitation that I should note. So presentation should include those contextualizations, those caveats. It is okay, by the way, to do some speculation. It's okay to do some extrapolation, but a good science communicator will have kind of a labeling sandwich for that. And they will say, just so you know, I'm about to speculate. This is an extrapolation of research. I may not be correct here, but I believe the following to be true. And then when you wrap up, say, and by the way, I could be wrong about that. So it's important when I'm consuming your science-based content, it's not that you can't speculate at all. It's not that you can't go out on a limb, but I need to be able to tell when you're speculating and when you're telling me cold, hard, strongly robust, essentially facts at that point. I need some visibility into the gradation of the confidence of your various claims or strategies you're discussing. So I think a good science communicator needs to reflect and very clearly specify their level of confidence as they go. And layer in caveats and qualifiers as appropriate. I think a good science communicator will always acknowledge the hierarchy of evidence as they go. If you're building a whole case based on 2 rodent studies, you need to let me know about that. And you should talk very differently when you're saying, well, based on 7 recent controlled trials. Now we're talking about a very different thing here. A good science communicator will not say everything with certainty. They will not have this unwavering level of confidence. They will not treat their, it's not boxing. Your goal is not to go 49-0 and then retire the best ever. Science communicators, it's not about having an unblemished record, right? It's about being as close to the truth as you can today. And the more that you try to hold on to an unblemished, undefeated, I've never been wrong record, the worse you are getting as a science communicator. And so along those lines, the final thing I'll mention, a good science communicator, when you do get things wrong, and you will eventually, even if you're doing a terrific job, make an effort to update, clarify, and educate your audience. Bring visibility, because theoretically, if you're in this for the right reasons, the evidence that proves you wrong or contradicts your working model is just as informative to your audience as the stuff that supports your model. So the question is, are you trying to create fans and admirers, or are you trying to create an audience that you're educating? If you're trying to create unwavering fans with a cult-like level of support, then of course you never want to admit that maybe you were wrong 2 years ago. But if your goal is to educate, it really shouldn't matter. So that's what I would say about that. And in terms of solutions moving forward, it's tricky because solutions always start with people like you and me, Helms, who are like, early-ish half of their academic career. And they're saying, if we were in charge, things would sure be a whole lot different, right? And it's probably going to take 20, 25, 30 years for that to actually become a reality. But I personally, rather than saying, hey, let's create this kind of convoluted graded model of corrections and retractions and contextualize them, I say forget about it. I actually have an idea. Nowhere near enough time to discuss this in detail, but it's not fully fleshed out. But I would love to hypothetically move toward a model where instead of having papers that get published or don't get published, essentially what we're doing with that model is we are dichotomizing the variable of quality. You either got over the bar or you didn't. And if you didn't get over the bar there, you just go over that way. You get over the bar somewhere else. So it's this vague high variance bar that separates quality enough from not quality enough. I don't think that works. I'd love to see a publishing model. And then you get into the finances of academic publishing. It's crazy. I'd love to see a model where we don't do journals anymore. We just do preprint servers. And basically you would have folks who have a reviewer profile where you kind of can say, okay, I have credibility for this paper that I am providing a post-publication review of. And I don't give it a thumbs up, thumbs down. I actually give it a quantitative score out of 7 or out of 10 or out of 100. And so what you would do is basically aggregate a sufficient sample size of reviews from qualified reviewers that give you an aggregated score across various metrics for that paper. And the reader can then look at the distribution of reviews for that paper and get a lot of insight about, do experts think that this was well designed? Do experts, think that this is a generalizable finding? And I think the reason I bring up distribution is when you see a paper that gets a ton of reviews that are like 65 out of 100, you say, not so great. But when you see a paper that gets a bunch of reviews that are like a 55 out of 100 and a bunch of reviews that are a 95 out of 100, that alone tells you, oh, okay, so there's some unsolved, things need to be worked out in this area. This is perhaps a controversial finding that garners a lot of enthusiastic support and a lot of enthusiastic pushback. That's very different from just the average quality score, right? So having that type of bimodal distribution could be highly informative, or having high variance in the distribution. So no one cares what I'm talking about anymore. But the general idea is I'd love to move toward a model where basically everything is post-publication peer review. Instead of relying on the dichotomized opinions of 2 or 3 people, we actually have open opinions of maybe 75 experts in the area who, by the way, the thing that makes this all work, the folks doing these reviews, that effort should be very highly considered when it comes to matters of tenure and promotion. That should be considered part of their job, that they clear out their afternoon and they do reviews that day. Right now, the peer review process just asks academics like, hey, while you're at your kid's soccer game sitting in the stands, would you like to just go ahead and review a paper for us? We'd love to pay you, but we only made $4 billion in revenue last year, so that's going to be a no-go for us. It doesn't make any sense.
I'm not going to say anything more eloquently than that. You did a fantastic job describing the qualities of the goal and what you should see in a science communicator. And it's something that I will well heed myself. And I think it is a excellent way of framing it. And 100% agree on everything you said about the peer review process. And I'm very intrigued. You said no one cares. I care, Eric. I'm very intrigued about the idea of kind of moving from a dichotomized to a continuous variable on grading papers and looking at and also looking at different distributions so you can not just see an average. I think that's really cool. And yeah, I have asked myself many times, what do journals do really? And the answer, I think, is up for questions, to put it out there.
Well, for a long time, they said, well, we do all the formatting, but some of them just send out a template and say, put it in yourself. So I don't even know what they claim.
Yeah. And look, can I just say one thing? Special issues, this isn't a thing anymore. People look at individual papers online. I don't get anything in the mail anyway.
Yeah. Folks. But, Helms, last thing I wanted to say, you mentioned that you were going to heed some of what I was saying. And I'm really glad that you said that, because this was actually an intervention, and Omar did not have the stomach for it. To be honest, he's very conflict averse, but we've been meaning to talk to you, and I'm glad that you took it well. And we could air this episode. I don't know if we plan to or not, but I'm glad that the message has been received.
You know what I say? Let's air it, because I've been needing to hit rock bottom, and when you hit rock bottom publicly, there's an element of accountability. So I plan to do better, folks. I'm going to admit it. I actually have been wrong, at least a couple times, and it is even possible that I will be wrong in the future. And rather than trying to hide the fact that I have been wrong and will be wrong, I'm going to embrace being wrong and see if it can make me a better person, maybe 10% the man you are, Dr. Trexler.
That's a nice goal. I love it.
Folks, you've just been blessed by our dear Dr. Trexler with not only information and perspective, but also wisdom. And if you can't like that, then I just don't know what will please you. But I hope this was a pleasing episode. I think it deserves at least a rating and review if you don't have the time to send it out to 200,000 other people. And around here, like I mentioned earlier, people do typically leave 5-star ratings. But you know what? If you leave less than a 5-star rating, I'm going to take that on the chin and actively think about what I can do better. So you leave whatever rating and review you think is necessary and appropriate, and we will do better. And in fact, we'll be doing better every single insert day here. Catch you in that next episode.